Wall furniture, Jim?
That's right. Furniture for the living room, the dining room, and the bedroom, plus all of our accessories.
How long is this sale on?
Only while stocks last. People should shop now so they won't be disappointed.
Thompson & Page for beautiful Drexel Heritage furniture at prices you won't believe.
Good morning. I am inclined to think that Prime Minister Mulroney, and yes, even the Honourable Pat Carney, thinks that we are all born stupid. Now let me explain a simple fact of life to you. There is a burgeoning scandal in Ottawa right now over the purchase by the Liberal government of the shares of Petrofina for a small sum of money like $1.46 billion. And there are allegations that we, the mugs, the taxpayers of Canada, paid something like $30 a share over the market. We did do that. It was for sale to Petro-Canada at $120 a share and sold at that when the price on the market was $90 a share. And we're also told that there was some kind of smelly fiddle involving a $200 million tax advantage for the Belgian owners of Petrofina. So the Auditor General, Kenneth Dye, wants to get all the details. Mulroney promises them during the election and now can't give them. And we are now told that all these documents are cabinet secrets, and that not only the Auditor General, but the Honourable Pat Carney and the Honourable Prime Minister Mulroney can't get access to these documents because of a ruling made by the Clerk of the Privy Council, Gordon Osbaldson. Now, he relies on a public service, that means a civil servant interpretation of the Access to Information Act. This was the same guy who told John Turner that he faced a constitutional crisis if he refused to appoint Trudeau's patronage list. And I want to put it even more simply. Supposing during the last Liberal government, the mafia had taken over the cabinet and organised mass murder across the country, Mulroney would be standing up in the House of Commons now and saying, I want to give you the information, but we can't even take a peek at the documents. They must think we're half-wits. And I want to show you the lame excuses given by Mulroney and Carney coming up now in the House of Commons yesterday.
I'm not trying to hide a single thing. We weren't involved directly or indirectly in the Petro-Canada transactions. We're just here trying to provide the Auditor General with the truth and the whole truth. That's what we're up to.
The secrecy goes so far that even Pat Carney, the energy minister, can't find out what her predecessors were up to.
We don't know what's in there because we're not allowed to look. And, it could be a bestseller, but I can't even take a peek at it.
She's telling us, the Minister of Energy from British Columbia, that she can't find out the details of the deal by which the taxpayers of Canada may have been done out of hundreds of millions of dollars. And I, for one, absolutely refuse to accept that. Mind you, we have not seen hide nor hair of a living Tory member since they were elected. They are still not allowed to speak to anyone in their constituencies, because Mr. Mulroney doesn't think they are yet well enough trained to be able to talk freely to people. One little point we'll follow up. There is a prospect we might see Carney, we'll never see Mulroney, but we might see Carney on the air in all the West Coast media before the next election. That's about the best prospect we have at this moment. But there was an election last week in Vancouver, which is going to provide the news media with all kinds of thrilling coverage in the months to come. That's the election of the new slate, the tough slate, the public sector slate, the extreme left-wing slate, at the BC Federation of Labour. And we are graced this morning by the presence of Cliff Andstein, who took the job of Secretary-Treasurer away from that somewhat rough character Mike Kramer. And we're going to ask Mr. Andstein quite simply this morning if they're really going to send $42,000 to the man Scargill who wants to smash democracy, the Marxist-Leninist, continue the strike and smash democracy in the United Kingdom. But we'll find out from Mr. Andstein about that a little later. And then a very tough topic indeed. One which involves the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. And you all know what's been happening over the years at this formerly much praised institution in Toronto, where 29, 36, 43 suspicious deaths of little babies in the cribs, and 2 nurses centered on the investigation, the Trainer woman and the Nellis woman. And here this morning is Ted Bissland, who has written The Digoxin Murder at the Sick Kids. Not a happy story. Have I covered it all? First, Arthur Scargill's friend, Cliff Andstein of the BCGEU, after the break. Cliff Andstein, I don't know whether to say congratulations or commiserations on your forces' victories in that alliance with the extreme left to throw Monroe out of the Fed.
Well, so far people are giving about 50% of each, and it wasn't just an alliance to throw Monroe out of the Fed.
That's the way it turned out.
That's one of the things that happened.
Let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Have you yet sent a check for $42,000 to Scargill, the Marxist-Leninist, who is trying to smash democracy in Britain, which is apparently the wish of your new body of people in the BC Fed?
Well, no, we haven't. I don't take over at the Federation until January. But the money's going to the children and wives of striking miners to help feed them in the winter months in England, not to Arthur Scargill.
To help prolong the strike, which is not supported by official British Labour and which is an illegal strike in every which way.
To feed striking miners, their wives and children, who are fighting a very tough battle to save a way of life, to save jobs for themselves and for their children, and to save entire communities.
You're not planning to send any money to the IRA next week, are you?
No, I understand that's mostly done in the United States.
I see. Have you got tell me how it came about. I thought the plan at the Fed was to allow the miners to sell $2 buttons. Did some of the commie delegates from the fishermen get up and say, money, money, money?
No,
money?
that's not the way it happened. It's traditional at the Federation, something like this, to take up a collection off the floor. And it's been happening across the country. I had the advantage of, when I was in Alberta a few weeks ago, of listening to a spokesman from the National Union of Miners, and also talking to him about some of these things. And maybe you should get one of them on the show someday.
Had one on. Don't tell anybody,
Okay.
But they raised $900. I was going to keep that a secret. But,
And so there was a collection being taken up, and somebody got up and said maybe the Fed should match it. And the president, my colleague, the president, suggested that if Mike Kramer moved a motion and I seconded the motion, that the Fed would match the money. So one of Mike's last jobs and one of my first jobs will be to find that money.
So the defeated Kramer moved the motion, and the new boy Andstein seconded the motion, and you are now going to send a total of 21,000 donations, 21,000 matching from the Fed, $42,000 to feed the starving children in Britain. Is that correct? That's correct.
That's correct, Jack.
Have you got the money to send?
We've got the money, but it's going to mean rejuggling it from some other areas, and so that's some of the decisions we'll make with the Executive Council in the spring.
I understand some officials of the Fed are worried that if you send that money first, there won't be enough money for their severance pay, car allowance, and holiday pay. Is that correct?
I haven't heard that.
You'll look into that, though.
I'll look into that.
Which would have the priority, the severance pay, holiday pay, and car allowances for Fed officials, or the money to Scargill?
I don't think it's going to be a question of priorities. In any event, the money to the mine workers is a convention resolution, and we'll get it.
And it's going to go to Scargill.
It's going. No, it's not. By the way, it goes to the Miners Relief Fund, TUC-CLC.
Oh, it
not
does.
to Scargill or the leadership of the Mine Workers Union. It's administered by the Canadian Labour Congress and the Trades Union Congress in England.
Wouldn't it have been better used for the hard-pressed food banks in British Columbia?
We're already, Labour councils have been the major force behind food banks in all of British Columbia, and also have been part of the raising funds for Ethiopia.
So you're doing all the good you can, but
All
the
the way-
most money
right
goes
across
to
the board.
Scargill. You'll forgive my paranoia about sending the money to Scargill, won't you?
Yes.
You will. Okay,
It's
now
pretty
let's look at the
tough,
Fed. Does this mean, this new alignment, did Kennedy, the militant left-winger, get all of his nominations on the Executive Council and the other body?
No, well, the structure is 2 full-time officers, and there are 12 vice presidents who are the executive, and the Executive Council has 25 members at large from various unions. No, the membership of both the Executive and the Executive Council is very broad-based. It represents people from all over. For example, both Joy Langan and Owen Dykstra, who were part of the Monroe slate, they're on the Executive Council. Or they're on as vice presidents. People who supported Kuby are on as vice presidents. People who supported Kennedy are on as vice presidents.
Do you think that the disappearance of the IWA, who declined nomination for the positions, and of Monroe will be an advantage or a big handicap for the BC Fed?
That's hard to say right now. I think there's going to be a disadvantage for the membership of the IWA because we're going to be making some fairly important decisions in the first few months of 1985, and they should be represented at those decisions.
But they will not be represented now, will they?
At the present time, they won't be represented. I'm going to be meeting, along with Kuby and myself, we'll be meeting with the officers and the Executive Council to see what we can do about that. But
Is this not the final split over the bad feeling which existed between the IWA, which was subject to the bankruptcies of the economy, and the protected civil servants? Is this not the final division between you and those people in the private sector?
10,000 government employees that have been laid off and fired over the last 2 years don't feel very protected. No, I think it's simplistic to say that this is simply a private sector, public sector fight. Certainly, there were a lot of private sector unions that were opposing the positions taken by Jack Monroe and others. And
how are you going to mix in though with Kennedy's boys? You've got a strong extreme left-wing group now in the Fed for the first time in probably 40 years, 35 years.
Well, the left has always been, and rather than saying extreme left, I mean there's always been a strong left element in the BC Federation of Labour. There's a strong center element, and
center element's gone. Monroe's away.
Monroe is probably more on the you know, if you have a center-right coalition that we were part of and a center-left coalition, I mean, Monroe is more to the right side of the Federation.
Do you think the IWA will continue after the snubs and the fights on both sides, and the tears, and especially the snubs to Gruntman, will continue to give you $200,000 a year per capita when they don't have to?
Well, that's going to be up to them. I mean, we've been through this type of thing before in 1976 when I was part of putting together a slate at the Federation with John Fryer and others, on the steelworkers. We lost that year. We continued to run for Executive Council positions. We didn't get anybody elected. We stayed around and came back in '78, got reelected. It took the steelworkers till 1980 to get reelected. People just didn't pull up their marbles and go home.
Does it mean a much blunter approach to the social credit government of Victoria? You now have Roy Gauthier, the famous non-affiliation rights boy, fishermen prominent, Kennedy's people prominent, and you people prominent. No middle ground. Does it not mean more of a confrontation aspect to to Bennett and Victoria?
Well, that's certainly going to be up to the good doctor, because they're the ones who have been picking the issues over the last year and a half, and coming at first the public sector, building trades, industrial unions. And I think what you're going to see over the next year is the unions themselves getting together, coming up with programs. We'll be sending some messages to the government, and maybe it's time for them to back off and sit down and try to figure out how we're going to create some jobs and get some employment in this province instead of just beating unions into the ground.
How long do you think Kuby will last? Monroe said very brutally that he found Kuby crying in a corner at the Fed. I mean, and after all, Kuby is a lame duck. He only got in by happenstance, didn't he?
Well, he did get a majority of ballots. He's got a 2-year term. We'll see.
You'll see. I'd like you to tell Mr. Andstein this morning what attitude you would like the BC Federation to take in this time of crisis. Now I'm being serious. Not that I haven't been serious all through the interview. I was serious about Scargill too. To tell Cliff Andstein what attitude you want them to take the Social Credit Government in Victoria after the break. Armstrong. Go ahead from Armstrong, BC, to Cliff Andstein, the new Secretary-Treasurer of the BC Fed.
Hello, Mr. Andstein. Mr. Webster indicated that he would like to hear from some of the people from British Columbia, the direction they'd like the BC Fed to go.
Yeah.
I wish not only the Federation, but the government of British Columbia would get back to the basics, and if they would take their direction from God's Word, from the Bible.
Thank you, ma'am. Go ahead, please.
I'm going to be as strong as I can with you, fellow. I'm a union member, and I find it despicable that you're taking my money to send to that communist in England, and we have no say. And we're a little fed up with people at the top who are communists and like to support communist causes around the world, taking local money. Why don't you use it to help the people right here in BC?
Well, first of all, you see, the Soviet Union sent 900,000, and Scargill spent some time with Gaddafi in Libya, who's an eminent, lovely fellow, and that's a fair question. The membership got no say.
Right here.
No, that's a fair question. I'm not a communist. I don't like Gaddafi and things like that. But just on the other point, half of that money was raised on the convention floor by the delegates, reaching into their pockets and pulling it out of the, it's their own cash. And the resolution was made by people that, if you're a local union member, you presumably elected and sent to the convention.
You don't represent the working man.
Well, there were 1,400.
An ideology at the top.
Well, there were 1,400 people there.
You get elected through the back door. Why don't you stand up and get elected like a Bennett or a Skelly or somebody like that? Not take our money through the back door to get your ideology across.
Thanks for your call. Now, you see, that's unfortunate because you're not a communist, never have been, never will be, and all the rest of it. But you're going to be tagged as that by that fella. You talk about that commie Andstein.
It doesn't matter. He would have tagged me by it anyway.
It's a different role for you to play all of a sudden, isn't it?
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Morning.
Yes. In response to that last guy, I'm not too familiar with communists or dictators, but I'm getting a little bit of a taste of dictatorship here in BC with Mr. Bennett. And if there was a choice, I'd sooner be a communist. However, that's not the point. It'd be my suggestion to this union to push this government when they get in all the way and everybody knows what's happening. Push this government as far as possible. Even an illiterate, such as myself, knows that this government is out to push us, break the union, and then get his people to hire us at $3 and $4 an hour. The 270,000 jobs that are supposed to be out today, and that's exactly what they're paying. And after he can break the union, get us down to that $3 an hour wage, only then will he be happy.
Okay, that's a...
Break that is just push this government. All you can do, we've got to shut her down, and I'm one that's got to starve to death, then I'll starve along with him.
Oh, I think he makes a lot of good points. The first time I heard the phrase deunionization was from a senior public servant who's an advisor to the Premier. I mean, I think that most people look at the government's policies as being isolated. Private sector, public sector, Expo here, Duke Point there. I think they're all really together as part of a plan to deunionize British Columbia and to make the union movement weaker and do exactly what the caller said.
In other words, Andstein tells Webster that he believes that Bennett is out to smash unions in British Columbia.
That's right.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning, Mr. Webster, Mr. Andstein. I'm a laid-off steelworker, and going back to your original question about what we want from the BC Fed, I'd like to see some moderation and working together with the government, because I believe that you guys who are basically dominating the Fed now are sitting cushy, and the craft unions represented by Jack Monroe are out in the cold. And unless you can sit down and work with the government and get some more jobs into this province and stop scaring them off, then we're going to be in a hole going into 1990.
Well, again, I mean, that's not a contradiction to what I said earlier. I mean, the government has got to stop trying to smash the unions, though. But going back to what one of the other things the caller said, on the Executive Council and on the vice presidents of the unions, for example, Ken Giorgetti from the Steelworkers is there, Gauthier is there from the carpenters, Gruntman's there from the paper workers. I mean, there are a lot of people out of the private sector unions.
Is Lon Robson on the executive?
No, he isn't.
You're lucky.
Who want to get jobs for their members, and the Fed is already working on project employment to try to raise money, to try to get funding, to try and develop policies that they can take to the government.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Cliff, I understand from the news reports that I've been seeing that vote on the English coal strike has never been put to the union. Am I right?
No, it was only put.
No, it wasn't. You're right.
Okay, so in this respect alone, I have to take the position that I object to BC trade union funds being sent over there until and unless he puts that thing to a vote of the union members. Now, the other point that I want to get across to you guys, and I want you to hammer Mr. Bennett with, is leave our education system alone. You cannot educate people to work, to do jobs, to do anything with an education system that's going down the rain barrel faster than anything else that I've ever seen. I just can't believe what they're trying to do to it.
Cliff?
Well, I think most people now are realizing they've gone too far in education. Certainly the members that I represented in my own union who work in the education field have been saying that. Again, on the question of the vote and the mine workers, one of the things I learned very early in the trade union movement is that when another union's out on strike, you don't go second-guessing their strategies, their tactics, or the issue for which they are out on strike. If they've got a picket line up, that's a picket line. You respect the picket line.
That was one of the irritants, was it not, with Jack Monroe, who said, "The hell with Gruntman and the boys."
Well, he didn't exactly say that. I mean,
More or less.
But it's still a very fundamental principle that it's the other union's
You've got to support a
decision.
strike it right along, even if it's led by one of the worst communists on the face
You've
of the
still
earth.
got to deal with the fact that it's a Tory government in England that's trying to break that union, trying to break that industry, and destroy an entire way of life, and lose tens of thousands of jobs. And the fact that
totally illegal
those
strike.
men, women, and children need money to live on.
You wouldn't go out and strike as Scargill took his men without a vote. There was no vote in that strike. Totally illegal strike.
Different system in England.
Certainly is. Go ahead, please.
Yes, good morning, Cliff.
Good morning.
I'd like to say congratulations, first of all, and
Thanks.
And I'd like to, although I was not at the convention this year, I read with great interest the slate which was elected. And I think there's one point that Jack is missing here. That's probably one of the better balanced elected slates that the Fed has had for many years, and is very, except at the exclusion of the IWA, is very representative for a change of many of the smaller and larger unions. And I think that point is not coming out. In spite of Jack's ranting and raving and red baiting on the Scargill question, I think the Fed made the correct decision there, and I think, as you said, it's not our point to be involved in the internal workings of that union. And I'd like to say congratulations. I think the Fed is going to be a stronger organization for it this time.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure you thank you very much.
Well, there's another point there, though, that does get overlooked with all of the, sort of...
hyperbole.
Hyperbole, but the cult of personality and self-appointed spokespersons and leaders and things like that is that there is a Federation executive that those vice presidents, there's 6 new vice presidents this year. The Executive Council has a lot of new faces on it from a wide range of unions, and I think it's going to be really exciting. I think it's going to be a good group of people to work with, and I think it's going to be much more productive than it has been the past 2 years.
I know that one thing that irks the IWA, and it probably irks the BCG as well, they pay close to $200,000 a year for 157 delegates. The fishermen, 2 men in a rowboat, pay $16,000 a year for 78 delegates. Well, obvious, Monroe's going to cut back on that, and he'll say, hey, I either want 4 times as many delegates or 10 times as many delegates as them, which is possible if he broke them up into little locals. I mean, the fishermen are vastly overweighted in their representation, are they not?
That's a problem that's been addressed in a number of years in terms of the structure of representation of the Federation is based on local unions rather than on membership of unions. There are pros and cons. I mean, it ensures that the representation comes from the locals, that the people at the local level get to elect their delegates, that they're not appointed from on top. On the other hand, there were problems of larger unions not having representation by population.
Sure.
We addressed that a couple of conventions ago and made significant changes to the Constitution and reached what at that time was a compromise that everybody, including the IWA, agreed with.
Still unfair. I mean, I know that some local...
Well, representation by population to some extent is very difficult to achieve.
It's got to be half and half. I'll agree. But, I mean, the prediction, obviously, is you ain't going to get 200,000 a year from the IWA, are you? You'll be lucky if you get 50. And then you won't be able to send the money to Scargill. Unless the Federation executive officers give it to them out of their large paychecks. Not likely.
No.
Let's have another little segment with Cliff after the break. Cliff Andstein, the new Secretary-Treasurer of the BC Fed. Go ahead from Gibson's.
Yeah, Mr. Andstein.
Yep.
For a long time, I had hoped that, especially in light of these economic circumstances, that Labour would finally develop a moderate, compromising stance. And the only union that I have seen to do this is the IWA. Now, as an independent businessman, I'd really hoped that we would see an attitude of cooperation from Labour, but I don't think we've seen that. And after seeing the results of this election at the BC Fed, I don't think we're going to see it. And I'm beginning to believe that we're going to have an all-out war with Labour in this province in order to finally crush your ridiculous movement and get some of that pathetic socialist dogma out of the air and get back to reasonable basics. Your movement makes me sick.
I don't know, is that worth responding to?
Yeah, it is.
Okay,
A lot of people think like that.
cooperation's a two-way street. We didn't pick the fight with the government. The government picked the fight with us. A lot of people, like the last caller, I mean, from their point of view, cooperation from us is simply saying, hit me again, kick me when I'm down. Well, we're not going to do that.
But Cliff, we
represent the largest, organized section, of the trade union movement on this continent. We are not going to roll over and play dead. There are hundreds of thousands of workers in this province who are in trade unions. They have chosen those trade unions. We represent them.
That's not what the guy said. You're still speaking as a BCGEO
No, I'm
official.
speaking as an official of the Federation,
but you're still in the
which
mindset.
represents all trade unions.
You've got an extreme left-wing, powerful militant group now, allied with the public sector unions, who are more protected from the chill winds than the industrial unions, right? The businessman regarded the guys who can be laid off at a moment's notice, like the IWA, as a good kind of steady bellwether. They're gone. The second biggest union in British Columbia is outside, will make its own statements, I presume, do its own policy, and we're left with the fanatical left and the civil servant right, and that means confrontation with the government.
But there are some myths in what you've said about, the public sector has not been insulated from the recession. Just coming in this morning, just talking about the school system in British Columbia, 400 positions lost in the last year. That's a fair
Yeah, but
proportion.
you're always supported by the taxpayer. When a sawmill or a plant goes bankrupt, they're down and out. Sook Forest Products, L&K Lumber, you can name dozens of them. Gone. Finished. Done.
Okay. Supported by the taxpayer, it's true. To provide highways, healthcare services, education services. They are part of the economic structure of the province.
Yeah, but the point he was making was that you've moved to the left.
The point he was making was that unless we just simply give up, let the government do what it wants, let the government turn the whole entire province into a special economic zone, then we're not being cooperative.
No, he's saying that the whole complexion of the Fed has moved sharply to confrontation and the extreme left. That's what he's saying. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. Let's forget it. We'll see what happens. The test is going to come very soon, I'll tell you.
Certainly.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi. I'd like to see the BC Fed start up again the Solidarity Coalition, and now that they've got Jack Monroe and the guys that are in bed with the Socrate government out of the BC Fed, because I don't think that this is a left-wing group or anything like that. The Socreds are exhibiting signs that couldn't be even called far right, and that they need to be stood up against. And I think Solidarity Coalition is a good way to start.
Are you going to bring back solidarity in its full bloom, Cliff Andstein? Is that your plan?
Well, that's certainly not up to me or any other individual.
You're one of the principal spokesmen now. What are you telling these people out there? That Andstein is all for solidarity, picketing and strikes, and bash social credit into the ground. Is that the message?
No, I'm not advocating that. But at the same time, if the government continues on the tack it's been on, in terms of cutting social services, in terms of not doing anything for the private sector. One of the things a lot of the private sector people miss is the government hasn't done anything to help create jobs in the private sector. The Conference Board of Canada, the Economic Council of Canada, all of them say that what the government policies on the budget, government policies on the restraint have hurt the private sector, have created unemployment in private sector jobs.
But it was so much easier to talk to Kramer, who answered with simple didactic explanations. However, we'll see how you develop after a few executive meetings with the boys. Eh?
Okay, John.
I'm not being snarky
No,
to you. I'm just saying you still are responding as a reasonable trade unionist. You haven't yet got the patina of a spokesman who's got to be rough to show these social credit finks in Victoria that are up against the toughie.
I think you can be tough, whatever it takes, without necessarily punching it up. I do have hysterics, by the way. You haven't talked to the right people. I mean, it depends. I mean, it's just not, it's behind closed doors. I have a lot of my fights behind closed doors.
That's the place to have
And I think that's where we should have a lot of our union fights and our fights in the Federation behind closed doors, not sitting here. I mean, this is an important forum to talk to you, to talk to other people, but...
No policy fights here.
No policy fights.
But we're so used to blood in the streets and to hell with social credit from Federation spokesmen that it's a shock not to get one.
I think if somebody did to me what they did to Jim Kinnaird when that speech came down, I'd say to hell with social credit too.
Yeah,
I mean, that's right. That was.
I'd forgotten that. Go ahead, please.
Good morning.
Morning.
I have 2 comments to make, and then I'm going to hang up and listen to the answer, Mr. Webster.
Yes, ma'am.
First point. Britain does not need the assistance of anybody. They can take care of themselves. There are no food lines in Britain that I am aware of.
No food banks, no.
Second point is these unions should be ashamed of themselves, keep striking and asking for extra wages and benefits. They should be grateful to have a job. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Well, 2 things. One, it wasn't Britain that asked for the money. It was the National Union of Mine Workers themselves who came over to Canada and asked for it. So if you have a fight, ma'am, it's with the people from Britain, not with us sending money to Britain. On the second point, we haven't had a lot of strikes lately. We've had a lot of lockouts. We've had the employers lock people out in the pulp industry. We've had a dispute that was management initiated in the transit industry where money was not a problem. We've had a lockout of faculty at Okanagan College, the first one in Canada of an academic faculty. That was employer initiated. And we've just had the BC Rail serve lockout notice on their people. Again, employer initiated. And in most cases, supported by the government of British Columbia. So most of the lost time, the major industrial disputes in 1984 have been employer initiated and have not been unions going on strike for higher wages.
It's not surprising the government is stepping into the BC Rail lockout right away because they didn't have another long, lengthy strike in BC. So this time they'll act with firmness.
A lockout's not a strike, Jack. I mean,
I said lockout.
Yeah.
But this time the government will act with firmness on the BC Rail thing. So you may have a chance for an almost instant confrontation with social credit. Is that what you're looking for?
You mean they're going to order the employer to keep the employees at work?
I should imagine they probably will in this particular case.
Well, that may be a confrontation with the employers.
But it won't be a confrontation with you. But I wish you well in your first confrontation, and we look forward to seeing the pickets and the banners flying high, supporting Scargill and unionists in British Columbia.
Thank you.
My thanks to Cliff Andstein. It's going to be fun, though, isn't it?
I think it should be.
It should be fun. Next, the deadly serious topic of the digoxin murders at Sick Kids Hospital with Ted Bissland after the break. Thank you. Mr. Justice Samuel Grange is expected to report within the next couple of months on his incredible inquiry into the deaths of these little babies at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. The whole country was astonished and shocked by it. In the meantime, however, Ted Bissland, a well-known reporter, television and whatnot, has done a very good book on the digoxin murders at sick kids, Death Shift. And I'm going to ask you a question that you can't answer, just so we can establish the ground rules. Who did the killings?
That's, of course, I think, what everyone is asking, Jack, and what everyone has asked during this whole inquiry. And unfortunately, the commissioner is restricted at even making a finding in that direction by the Ontario Court of Appeal, a 5-man decision, of which he is normally a member, so it was his fellow judges that did this to him, and it's very frustrating. I don't think that was the entire point of this Royal Commission, of course, was to do that. We do that in a court of law. That wasn't the case here, and as you know, a Royal Commission has much more flexibility in the rules of evidence. But I think the public perceived it. I mean, as you say, the public was looking to find out exactly that. If there was murder at that hospital, I suggest that the evidence is overwhelming that there was, then who did it? He can't do that. I can't do it, obviously, because of the laws of libel and slander.
But you leave it to me to draw my own conclusions, which I did from this book.
Indeed. I think that's what everyone has done during this whole Royal Commission. They've looked at the evidence. I like to say that I sat at the back of the room and the commissioner sat at the front, and we looked at the evidence coming between us. And I put that evidence as best I could in the book itself so that a reader could draw their own conclusions, because I think that's what happened. We had television broadcasting of this live almost across the country, almost unheard of. So we had what was referred to as an electronic jury sitting across the country making their mind up as to who actually did do the murders at sick kids. Not the way our system should work, probably,
no, because
but that's it.
It's almost impossible for anyone. Forgetting the Nellis business where she was charged and she was not committed. She was acquitted, in fact.
No, she was discharged at preliminary hearing.
Discharged
lack of evidence.
Lack of evidence to convict. But so that it's almost impossible to get a fair jury across this country who've not been influenced by the reports, the hysteria, or anything else that arose out of these deaths.
I don't think there's any question about that. And unfortunately, what we have here was everything in name but a murder trial. We did not have that name applied to it, and that's the end result will be, this will be our only trial, Jack. This is the only thing.
How many children, and there are different answers to these questions, died in suspicious circumstances?
Well, according to the Atlanta survey, there were 36 in total in this 9-month period, which was an increase of 630% over any other comparable 9-month period. According to the Atlanta epidemiology study, which they did reviewing all these deaths, they put 29 in the category of being suspicious. The rest, they said, were natural deaths. But beyond that, of course, you look to see what the evidence is in the suspicious category to come to the conclusion of murder. We had Susan Ellis charged with 4 counts of murder for 4 of these infants. And the evidence I suggest that's come forward in this inquiry, I think the number now is probably moving up to around 8 or 9. I think that will be the area the commissioner will find, 8 or 9 definite murders. Beyond that, the proof falls off. I mean, the pattern of deaths and the suspicion still remains, but the proof just is not there to come to that firm conclusion.
8 or 9 children were almost indubitably murdered, and another number of very suspicious deaths where the proof falls short.
That's right.
Take the clearest case from your book, or any clear case, which would make you think that that child, whether it was Justin Cook or somebody else, was murdered.
Well, I think that's the obvious one, and everyone referred to that infant as being the case of murder. And the reason we can be so definite in the evidence that came forward in the case of Justin Cook, this was an infant who was never prescribed digoxin. He was on constant nursing care. There were only 2 nurses looked after him on that fatal night that he died. Also, digoxin had been locked up several hours before this infant died. What we had when he got into trouble around 3:30 in the morning is that we had blood sampling taken at the time before he died, blood sampling taken after he died, and the evidence then was overwhelming that there was astronomical levels of digoxin firmly there in his system. They could only have been put there by someone deliberately administering the drug, a drug that was not prescribed, in fact was contraindicated in that infant's condition. So that evidence becomes very conclusive. I don't think you can deny that. So then you have to look at who possibly could have done it. As I said, with 2 nurses only assigned to look after that infant, that's where it has to come from.
And you're prepared to tell me which 2 nurses it was?
Phyllis Traynor and Susan Nellis were the only 2 nurses. The police perspective was, when they arrested Nellis 2 days after that death for that murder, Their conclusion was that Susan Ellis was the only nurse that looked after that infant, because they said, yes, she was on constant nursing care. To their perspective, from the information they had, she was the only one. As we found out afterwards, subsequent, of course, is that Phyllis Traynor filled in for her while she went on meal breaks and had coffee breaks. But they were the only two. So if there's murder, where does it come from?
So therefore, the investigation which led to the charge of Nellis in that case wasn't quite complete at the time the charges were laid.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I think what's happened, Jack, is that we've had an interval of time, and we've had a lot of information and new stuff tossed into that hopper, and we come to a conclusion today entirely different than what the police had back at that point in time. I think on the information they had, with the evidence they had given to them by the medical people and what they understood to be the situation, I think they had reasonable and probable cause to make that arrest back at that point in time. Then they added 2 days later 3 more charges, and that's where I think their case started to fall apart. And I'm sure that's where the commissioner is going to be critical of the police in that case. But the first one, I think they did have reasonable and probable cause.
What were the failures in the other 3 in terms of the police?
Well, they couldn't lock Nellis in directly to it, and that's one thing. But they did see that she had been on schedule when that infant died.
But she'd been on vacation, actually.
No, that was another infant. That was another infant. But one of the ones they did charge in that initial lot, Janice Estrella, she had gone off shift 7 hours before that infant died. But the police, again, got a theory. And I mean, you can say what they were trying to take a piece of plasticine to make it all fit the case. What they had is that the IV needle into that infant had gone interstitial. In other words, come out of the vein and was going into the tissue. Therefore, that would slow down the absorption rate of the drug if it had been introduced. Therefore, they said, it could have been Susan Ellis. That didn't hold up.
What was the date of the first murder?
June 30th, 1980.
1980. This has been going on since 1980.
That's right. That's
what
right.
has it done to the Toronto Hospital for Sick Kids?
Oh, I think it's been a very dark page in their history. And you know, I tried to go out of my way to say the good things about that hospital. But this is a very dark page. I mean, it's affected certainly the history of this hospital with its world-renowned reputation. The medical staff obviously is affected. The nursing profession, I mean, feels very strongly about the cloud that's been cast over there.
I want to ask you about that too. I want to ask you why it's all on the nurses. Where the hell were the doctors? After the break. Ted Bissland, the reporter, author of the digoxin murders at Sick Kids called Death Shift. I was going to ask you, the nursing profession's taken an awful kicking. But the common impression abroad on the West Coast, and we're isolated by and large, is that the doctors didn't seem to carry any heat or burden of the day at all. Is that totally wrong, my view of it from the coast?
Well, I think you're wrong to a degree. We did have 36 doctors roughly testify from inside and outside the hospitals. But as to the onus of responsibility, so we had a problem here. We had most of these infants dying in the small hours of the morning. What was happening was only when one nursing team was on duty. So that, again, narrowed your area of suspicion. The question was examined quite fully as to the scheduling of doctors, whether indeed any doctors were found on that ward. It's an unusual situation for them to be there at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning unless they're called for some sort of an emergency. So you didn't have a common denominator on scheduling, or you didn't have a common denominator of one doctor being seen on the ward when all of these 29 suspicious deaths.
They all appeared in front of the Grange Commission.
Well, it's certainly the major ones, the cardiologists, etc. But they're not there. And what happened, Jack, of course, is when you get to drugs being used as a murder weapon, it's nurses invariably, you see, who administer the drugs. The doctors prescribe, that nurses administer. So therefore, that's what's happened here. They now are aware, because of this whole inquiry, that administering the drugs, they have to now take some sort of responsibility for their actions.
Let's now come to how the children were murdered. Well, how were they murdered? What was the drug?
The drug was digoxin, a heart drug derivative of digitalis, which has been around for hundreds of years and is like aspirin for around that ward because of its use. Doctors rely on it as much as any other tool in their fight for these infants with very bad hearts.
It's a regulator.
It's a regulator. It slows and strengthens the heartbeat. And of course, if you have too much of it, we see what the effects are. And that's what's happened here. It was not accidental administration of a drug, because the therapeutic dose would not have the toxic readings that we found in these infants. I mean, astronomical readings, 30, 40, 50, 100 times beyond what would be the accepted norm.
When did the parents first know their children had been murdered?
Well,
because this is one of the great traumas of the whole business.
I think that's it. And I think we tend to forget that, considering all the things that have happened. The parents, of course, were the ones that really had to have the answers. I think this inquiry provided the answers for them. Well, they did not know until way down the line, Jack.
were these children all approaching death? The question I'm stretching for is, could these be interpreted in any way as mercy killings?
No, none whatsoever. Because,
none at all?
No, because you had 2 infants, for example, who had normal hearts. You had 1 infant that was ready for discharge in about 2 or 3 days. Mercy killing, euthanasia just does not apply. And if you recall in the book, when I go through the other cases of these kind of hospital murders, there's no motive, certainly not mercy killing in any of them.
Tell me the other cases, because I wondered when I started early on in the book, I thought, what the hell is he talking about all these gruesome things in the States for?
Right, because you start to see a pattern, Jack. You start to see nursing and, in one case, a doctor being charged with murder. You see a common hospital drug used as the murder weapon. We see the same kind of test procedures involved there as what we had to involve here in Canada. There weren't these tests before for the drug digoxin after death. We have a whole set of circumstances which are almost parallel in all instances to what we had here in Canada.
Give me some of the other mass murders in hospitals.
Well, we have the one, for example, in Texas right now, where Janine Jones, the nurse, is under a 99-year sentence, and now we have the medical...
What did she do?
She murdered an infant and was convicted on that. Now we have the medical examiners going back and looking at the hospital she was at, the University Hospital, where 46 infants are suspected of being murder victims, and that same nurse is suspected as well. They're now having to exhume those infants and do the test. They came to Toronto to see what kind of tests were developed there in the exhumation. They're going to do the same thing.
It's not unusual to have a person in a hospital who has some kind of phobia by which they're going to act as an avenging angel.
Well, or something. I think what boils down here, if you look at someone that's a mass murderer of sick infants in a hospital, you have to come to the conclusion that it's a psychotic. Now, how could that hospital, or how could this operation, for example, here, spot someone that would fit that pattern unless they were running up and down the hall screaming and bashing their heads? I mean, if they were doing their normal work, how would you spot them? It's something, obviously, that's buried within them. I spoke to a psychiatrist as part of the research on this to see if he could draw me a profile of an individual that could fit this kind of pattern. And I got the strangest response from him. He says, "My God, I can't. It's crazy." I mean, this was his feeling. It was so bizarre. You could not take someone to fit this kind of pattern. No doubt that it's a psychotic there.
What has it done to the nursing in the Toronto Sick Children's Hospital? How many nurses were investigated?
Well, they investigated, certainly Atlanta investigated all of the nurses that had come on that floor in any way whatsoever as part of their schedule for that 9 months, and that was a lengthy list. But what we looked at, of course, were specifically the teams that were on, and they split up 4 at one end and 4 at the other. It narrowed down, of course, to the trainer nursing team, composed of 3 RNs and 2 RNAs, because that's where the deaths were happening. I mean, we have all sorts of evidence to indicate that where the suspicion may lie in that particular team, and that's, I'm afraid, back to your original question, where we come to conclusions.
When was the first murder really established, and how much prior to that had the others been killed?
Well, we were talking March 1981, at the shank end of the 9-month epidemic of death period, as it was referred to. The nurses were concerned as early as the fall of the previous year. They went to doctors and said, "What is going on? Why are we having all these deaths on the ward? Are we doing something wrong?" The doctors adopted the medical perspective that these infants died because they were younger and they were sicker. In effect, of course, when Atlanta did the overview afterwards, they found that the infants on the population on the ward was younger, but they weren't sicker. In other words, the ones that died were healthier when they came on the ward than others who died in other 9 months.
After the investigation started, killings continued?
Oh, very much. I mean, if that's the route you go, I mean, you're way into March of 1981 before you ever came to the conclusion. Finally, the doctors are saying something is wrong, something sinister is going on, and one doctor concluding on the eve of the last murder, that of Justin Cook, that if we lose this infant, then we know we have a murderer in our midst. Very prophetic, I think.
That was in the Justin Cook case?
That's right.
He knew the child was there?
That's right.
And said, if this child dies, we know we have a murderer in our midst.
Indeed. And that was one of the senior cardiologists that said that.
Isn't that dreadful?
Well, I think the whole thing is dreadful, and it's very difficult, having gone through this as long as I have, without feeling a whole lot of mixed feelings about it. I just hope that some of that can come through in the book as people read through it.
What about digoxin itself? Was there not a report from the West Coast here which was used in Toronto?
Yes, there was, and that was the survey that was done here of newborns, in which there was a substance which gave a reading as if it was digoxin. They referred to it as substance X. The credentials on that stood up. It stood the examination, but without getting into too much detail, what happened is that the highest reading they found, even of this drug, which wasn't digoxin but gave the reading, was 4 nanograms. A nanogram is a billionth of a milliliter. And the therapeutic level for digoxin in the blood, acceptable, safe, is like 2.5 nanograms. So 4 nanograms was not a toxic level. Well, we've got infants here with 78, 100 nanograms, 400 nanograms. I mean, that's where you come to the conclusion that level being there can only be the result of a deliberate overdose act.
I hate to think what happens now if a child dies in the cardiac unit at the Toronto Sick Children's Hospital.
Well, as far as digoxin is concerned, that's not a factor, because ever since the arrest of Susan Ellis and ongoing from there, every death in that hospital in which a postmortem is involved, they do a test for digoxin. But of course, the bottom line is there are so many drugs in a hospital environment that somebody else, if that's the case, could use another one as a murder weapon.
And all the nurses are back at work?
All the nurses except Phyllis Traynor. I mean, Susan Ellis is back since summer of 1983. Not in that unit. There's only one of the members of that team that's still working on the cardiac ward. Janet Brownless, an RNA. She's on maternity leave right now. But all the rest except Phyllis Traynor is back at work. Phyllis Traynor has been paid by the hospital since February of 1982 to stay home.
More with Ted Bissland in this fascinating book on the digoxin murders at sick kids after the break. God knows what. A friend of mine took a small child to the Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto a couple of months back. Well-known man. He says that neither he nor his wife left the child's side at any time she was in that hospital for a week, and insisted on knowing from the nurse precisely what was being given and whose orders it were and looking at the quantities.
That's not an unusual happening. I have friends also who've had children in there, not for major things, but taken them in for day surgery, and the same kind of concerns there. I think that reflects itself on the part of parents, that they're really, in essence, concerned. They want to get their child out of there as quickly as possible. Realistically, they're saying, well, it shouldn't be that way. I mean, it's in one area and it was an isolated instance, and we know that the hospital does do good work, but it is a matter of concern.
In recounting the evidence in the book, I think you talk about the girl who went on holiday. There were no murders, and then there was murders when she came back.
Well, I don't think we can go as far as to say in those cases they were murders. They were, again, suspicious deaths, and that was the case of Phyllis Traynor. On the eve before she went on her honeymoon in the fall of 1980, there was a death. She was away for 3 odd weeks, came back. The very night she came back, there was another suspicious death.
Looking at it broadly, is the Grange Commission fair? Is it fair for you to write these books right now, kind of short-circuiting our normal system of investigation, charge, acquittal, or conviction?
Well, I think the whole process has been a short circuit of a lot of things. I think we had the Grange Commission because we had a judicial system that failed. It failed to provide the answers, and the public wants and is entitled to know, and certainly so are the parents. Is it fair for me on the book? I think it is, because it tends to, I think, take at least a year and a half plus, maybe we're talking even longer when you go back through the book, a whole bunch of ingredients and put them together so someone can succinctly sit down and say, golly, I mean, this is amazing. When you
I agree. When the system fails and cannot answer the question of such massive public importance as the suspicious deaths of 43 kids, 8 or 9 murders, right, it must be, the public must know about it in the greatest possible detail as soon as it possibly can. What's happened to the board of directors of the Toronto Hospital for Sick Kids?
Well,
what changes have they made? Because were they sitting on their thumbs blindfolded?
No, and if you recall, I refer in the book to another inquiry that was made about the hospital by Justice Dubbin. And this was an overview look at the whole hospital administration and operation, not just this specific area, although they touched on these deaths. What they did, they made 98 recommendations, and Dubbin was very critical in many of them for the hospital. They changed the composition of the boards, for example. There's more medical people on now than there was before, so they're not entirely just isolated administrators. Also, what they've done is recommended, and the hospital has put into practice, putting doctors from other disciplines into a review committee, whereas what we had here, of course, at that time frame were cardiologists looking at cardiology deaths. Now we have other disciplines that do it, and hopefully that kind of thing helps to sound the alarm if this pattern is repeated.
There have been no murders since, no suspicious deaths.
There have been no unusual suspicious deaths since the arrest of Susan Ellis in March of 1981.
You can take these calls. These are tricky.
Try my best.
Go ahead from Kelowna.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to ask 2 questions and then I'll hang up. First of all, was the pharmaceutical department, were they checked out because of the level of digoxin in the bottle? Could it have been higher, a higher dosage coming from the pharmaceutical department and the nurse is not aware? And number 2, is it possible at shift change, could the nurse on duty prior, could she have switched that bottle?
Well, I'll answer both those questions quite quickly. They did examine and went back right to the manufacturer and traced the process as far as the drug itself was concerned. What they did do, the test analysis found it was the proper strength drug in the individual vials. Beyond that, as to someone switching it, that doesn't seem very likely, although it was loose on the ward at that point in time. The investigation, obviously, looking back, that length of time couldn't come conclusively to that firm answer, but there was no strong indication of it.
Thank you. Now, there's a news report this morning that Susan Ellis is suing the Ontario Crown Attorney McGee.
Well, Bob McGee, of course, is no longer a Crown Attorney. He was the Crown Attorney at the time who prosecuted the case, but they've had a lawsuit ongoing, of course, and sitting on the back burner against the Metro Police, the Crown Attorney, and the AG in Ontario, but that has been stalled by the courts as far as the AG is concerned and the Crown Attorneys. Now, I don't know whether what you're referring to here is some sort of decision from the appeal court in that area or not.
Neither do I. Go ahead, please.
Yes, could you please tell me why nurse trainer is being paid to stay at home and why Susan Ellis is allowed back to work?
Well, that's the question that I posed to the lawyers for the hospital as well, and the answer that I got is that was a decision made at that point in time in February of 1982. And the horrible part is, of course, that she has not been charged with anything. It's likely, based upon the conversations I've had, that the hospital will make some sort of lump financial settlement and say goodbye to Phyllis Traynor. It's not likely she will ever return to the staff.
She's in the classic position of being innocent until and when she's ever proven guilty.
That's right, but of course this has not been the case here, Jack.
And Susan Ellis is back at work.
That's right.
Because she was cleared.
But she had to go 12 times, she said, roughly, almost on bended knee to get a job back in that hospital.
And she's not in the same...
Not in the cardiac ward.
Go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi. I'd like to find out how many children have died on the ward since, to date.
Since you answered that, but tell them again.
Well, I can't answer as of today. You mean that's died since that time in 1981? I can't really answer that. Off the ward? Well, it certainly hasn't been enough to create any suspicion, because if we look at the graphs, and I show that in the book, we have a normal death rate, and we've had a normal death rate on that ward. I mean, these are sick infants, there's no question about it. But what we did have in that 9-month period was an astronomical jump of 630% in the deaths on that cardiac ward. Deaths, by the way, which weren't reflected in the intensive care unit or in the operating rooms where you'd normally find a higher death rate, only on the cardiac ward itself. There's not been any sort of corresponding increase since then.
Go ahead, please.
Good morning. I find it strange that in Texas they had one baby death, yet they tried and convicted a woman, put her in jail, and they don't seem to be able to come to any conclusion in Toronto. Why is that? And also, when they first found out that the deaths were suspicious, and a lot of the people were complaining. It wasn't until the last baby died, and they insisted on removing his body from the hospital. And when they asked Nurse Traynor why did the parents do that, she said, well, because if they had let them perform the autopsy at the hospital, there would have been a cover-up. Why would the hospital cover up if they knew these babies were being murdered?
I don't certainly think that was the case in the last infant anyway, and what you're recalling doesn't ring a bell with me at all, the details of that. The first part of your question was regarding the nurse in Texas. I think the evidence there, obviously, and I'm second guessing from what I've been able to read and review, the evidence there was much more conclusive. But here we did not have a smoking gun or a knife in someone's hand. All we had was a time frame when who approximately could have been responsible for a death that happened. There, apparently, the evidence was much more overwhelming, thus the conviction.
I always felt that Susan Ellis was kind of unfairly dealt with when the police made the point, at what stage I don't know, that they charged her, because when they went to question her, she said, I want to talk to my lawyer.
That's right, and I think this gave us an insight into the police thinking, and I think you know...
Because she'd been under suspicion for a long while, and any intelligent person would say, my God, if they're going to jump at me, I'm going to have a lawyer standing by.
She wasn't under suspicion at that point in the true sense, Jack, and this followed the last death. What there was an inquest slated for another death that month of Kevin Paxai. Nellis had been the nurse that had looked after that infant, and she knew she was going to be questioned by the police. She'd asked her roommate what she should do if the police came to question her. The roommate said, don't do it unless you have, and the roommate was a law student, don't do it unless you have a lawyer present. So that's why she said she had the note in her pocket with the names of 2 lawyers when the police came. But when they asked her, it wasn't about the Paxi infant where she was expecting the questions. What they asked her about was the last death, Justin Cook. She was taken aback and said, I want to speak to a lawyer. The police perceived that right to remain silent, which she exercised, as another indication that they had the right person.
Because they said, I'm quoting in your book, normally they scream to high heaven that they're innocent.
That's probably, I mean, if you or I probably had the arm of the law put on us right now to be arrested.
I didn't do it.
That's right, but they didn't see any of that, and that's another reason.
I'm going to do some more phone calls to Ted Bissland on the Digoxin murders at 6 Kids after the break. Go ahead to Ted Bissland. Which station are you working on when you're working these days?
Well, I work with the CBC outlet in Toronto, CBLT, and do basically the legal affairs specialist area in the courts, which is how I got into this whole thing in the first place.
Very bright, said Webster, in a wry aside for a CBC chap.
But I started out in private.
Go ahead, please.
Yes?
Yes.
My father is a lawyer in Southern Ontario, and I think the consensus among his peers was that Susan Nels was guilty. And I guess in her first trial, or maybe the Grange Commission too, her lawyer purposely sat her with her back to the jury or the people.
Oh, I think it'd be highly unfair in terms of what's happened up to now, and I think your father's a lawyer that would not wish you to give his consensus on the air and then when he cut you off. Fair enough. People have been saying it anyway. But
well, I think
not
that's
fair.
true. You know, like even today, Jack, and it happens with anyone that's accused of any sort of major crime, and if you're discharged or acquitted, still people think you're guilty. And I think there's an element of the population that probably even today thinks, yes, Susan Ellis was the one.
Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was somebody else.
That's right.
Who knows who was slipping in the
One
hospital?
has to rely upon our judicial system.
Yeah, you've got to. You can't desert it. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm just calling in regard to a comment earlier with respect to her having a lawyer's name in her pocket. My wife is a nurse, and she was involved in something, you know, an inquiry within the hospital, and she got the name of a lawyer right away. She was recommended that by the union, and I think that's why Susan had the name of a lawyer in her pocket, quite simply to protect her, in the sense that when you're dealing with hospitals, people get very upset, you know, someone dies or something happens to them. You've got to protect yourself, and that's what the unions generally recommend.
Yeah. What was it? Was there any mass public reaction from parents throughout this? Any mass
throughout the inquiry?
From the parents of the dead kids?
Throughout the inquiry itself?
Or at any time?
No, not sort of a mass reaction. I think their reaction was earlier on when they were doing exhumations, etc., right into the preliminary inquiry of Susan Nellis, and that's where the Lombardo's family found out that there was digoxin in their child's body and the drug had never been prescribed. And again, they looked back, and that became the flaw for the police investigation and the prosecution of Susan Nellis. That death, Susan Nellis was on her holidays. So therefore, that took away from the fact that if it was one person that was responsible, it couldn't really be Susan Nellis. In other words, they gave the defense an ace when they came along here. But I mean, what would you expect from the police, Jack? Obviously, they should do that.
Sure, but the children had died, been properly buried with death certificates, the parents consoled, you know, the accident of nature, and then whammo, died.
That's right, and they find it there. And there was one other instance, of course, as I mentioned in the book, the Hines family, where they thought their child had died, and the hospital officially said of SIDS. They thought it was a viral infection which was affecting, and this child had a normal heart, Jordan Hines. He was on the cardiac ward because of the pneumonia he had, which was affecting the heart rate. Never treated with digoxin, never prescribed it, but he did die 48 hours later from, they thought, viral infection. The hospital said SIDS. It was the fall of that year of 1981. They get a death certificate from the coroner for the insurance claim. On it, they find cause of death, murder, digoxin overdose.
Oh.
Now, how would you like to get that kind of thing? And this is what was happening with parents. They just did not have the information.
They got the certificate cold.
That's right. That was the first indication to them that their child was a murder victim.
They'll never recover from that.
No.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to say, I'd like to ask Clive if he thinks this has been a cover-up for a lot of years, or just for recently. I had a child die in 1962, and they never came up with an answer.
Was that in a local hospital?
Yes, Vancouver General Hospital.
Well, I think the pattern of deaths, though, doesn't seem to have been duplicated anyplace else except in this isolated instance in Sick Kids Hospital. And one would hope that other hospitals, and I know that they've modified the routines as a result of what's happened at Sick Kids, one would hope that if there's some sort of pattern of this climb of deaths, that they would be able to detect it quite quickly now, based upon the experience here. But I think the fact that quite often, I mean, I've gone to enough inquests, and I'm sure Jack has over the years as well, that there is no pathological conclusion of why an infant died. That happens quite often. So I don't think, and perhaps the way you're talking there, that it's an isolated or unusual instance.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, I'd like to mention to Ted, was there any investigation done on David, Susan's brother, at the time this was all going on?
Just a moment, please.
Well, the investigation was not such other than the fact that they knew that her brother, who was a pediatrician, was on the ward at times. There's some conversations with him were part of the evidence of Susan Nellis, but I don't think there was anything to indicate he was in any way involved, any more so than any doctors, because the doctors, basically because of the scheduling, just weren't a suspect really in that whole end.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack Webster.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to ask a question and then hang up and listen to the answer. Since these suspicious deaths, how often did the doctor prescribe digoxin level to be done on the children? And if so, when did they start prescribing these digoxin levels?
On a therapeutic basis, any child that's on...
start again.
As a therapeutic basis, any child that's on digoxin as part of a treatment, there's a monitoring program. And that's what the case was. Any of the infants that they would take blood sampling from, find the digoxin level a little higher than it should be, then they would hold the digoxin back. And that's always been the case. But what has not been the case, of course, at Sick Kids was that they do not do post-mortem tests for that drug. And that didn't come on stream until one questionable area, if you recall, Jack, in January of 1981. Then subsequent to that, it was March. They found the readings in the one infant in January of 1981 were so high in the pathology report that they just rejected them as being a mistake and an error. Subsequent to that, obviously they weren't. It really wasn't until March of 1981 when they started to do standard digoxin testing as part of the post-mortem, and we know what happened in March.
I'm going to finish with Ted after the break. After the break. Going to have Ted again. Did the examination of the procedures in the Sick Children's Hospital, apart from the digoxin, show that everything was being done efficiently?
Yeah, I don't think there was any question of that, Jack. I mean, in the normal hospital procedures that were being followed, yeah, I think they've changed some of the procedures in light of what they've found to be some holes.
It showed it was still a good hospital despite the mystery killer.
I don't think there's any question of that.
Go ahead, please.
Do you not think that probably these children were not murdered, but just allergic to digoxin? Because I know an old man that had a heart surgery and was prescribed digoxin, and if he hadn't quit on his own, he probably would have been dead by now.
Well, that's a possibility, but obviously if you look at the fact that they found digoxin in at least 4 infants where it was never prescribed, I mean, I think that eliminates the fact that there was some sort of reaction. I mean, how did it get there? And how did it get there in the doses that they found in these infants? That's the major question. It could only be the result of someone deliberately overdosing. And that's what we're faced with here.
Prior to this, digoxin was what you might call an unlocked up drug.
That's right.
It was a free drug, you might say.
That's right, because, I mean, they used it like aspirin on that ward. I mean, that's how much of a tool it was, and it's the ward that you would expect it on, Jack.
Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'm a pediatric nurse, and I have a question.
Right.
If these infants were not seriously ill, they were ill, but not overwhelmingly ill, they more than likely would be taking fluids by mouth, and I'm wondering if the contents of the glucose water and formula has ever been suspected, examined, and investigated.
Well, to answer the first part of your question, the infants were sick. I mean, that's why they were on that ward.
More than likely would be at least getting sips of glucose water.
Well, not too often, because the accepted method of introduction of the drug, the murder device, if you wish, was the IV. In nearly all the cases, these infants were on IVs.
Yes, but they could still be given digoxin orally and get high blood levels.
Well, they can, but they went back on the testing, and if you recall your chemistry, that the blood or the sampling of digoxin would be in stomach contents. It wasn't found there, which indicated it wasn't given orally. It was found in the blood levels, and it was found in tissue. And I think that, again, goes goes along with the line that it was introduced directly into the system, not given orally.
But I still feel that there should be some investigation to the formula and the glucose water, because that would make access to other people besides non-nursing personnel.
Well, that would probably be true, but then it would show up all through the hospital. I mean, how would you have it just in this one particular instance in this ward, on the cardiac ward? It wasn't in intensive care. It didn't show up by the outside of the operating room. I mean, why was it just then on this one ward? That's the problem.
What was the worst plague of deaths in any short period?
I think in the last part of the epidemic, the March of 1981, that's when there was the heaviest
concentration. How did the
concentration.
nurses on the ward react to this? They must have been hysterical.
Oh, I don't think there was any question. As I pointed out earlier, that in the fall of 1980, they were already saying, what's happening? We had 5 deaths in July, we've got 5 deaths in August. What is happening here? I mean, most nurses will tell you that they can go through a hospital career and perhaps maybe encounter 1 or 2 cardiac arrests and possibly deaths out of it. Here, all of a sudden, one month we had 5, next month we had 5. I mean, that was an astronomical number right to start with. This kind of pattern up and down through the next 9 months.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, sir. What is the status of the police investigation right now into this affair, and what are the chances that someone will ever be charged? I'll hang up. Thank you.
Okay. The police investigation is at a standstill right now and has been since the beginning of 1983. They've thrown up their hands, put a report into the chief of police, went on to the attorney general, that they have done everything they possibly could at that point in time. I don't think anything new, although there's been new evidence that came out of the Grange inquiry, I don't think there's been enough evidence from their perspective to induce them to lay charges against anyone else. I'm afraid that what we've gone through was a trial, and that's the only trial we're going to have, and I doubt very much anyone else will be charged. We have a mass murderer that just walks away.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd just like to comment on the statement that Ted made about Phyllis Turner being paid by the hospital to stay at home.
Yes.
She was asked back in 1983 at the same time Susan Snell was, but she had declined because she had just had a child and they had put her on maternity leave. And I'd also like to say that at the time of questioning, when everything came up about the suspicious deaths and the murders, all members on the team were away on leave of absence until they cleared up a few things, until they had arrested Susan.
Well, you're partially correct. Certainly as far as the maternity aspect with Phyllis Turner in 1983, you're quite right. But this is now 1984. She's still being paid to stay home, and there's no indication that the hospital is going to bring her back.
And there's no indication in your considered expert opinion that anybody is going to be charged in the foreseeable future?
I'm afraid not.
A great book. Gruesome, but not gruesome. Fascinating book. Death Shift by Ted Bissland. I'll be back after the break. Tell you the truth, I'm not quite sure what we're going to be doing tomorrow morning. A couple of things on the fire. There's a goody one on drug addiction, one on the waterfront. Well, we'll decide later this morning what we're going to concentrate for your delight and charm tomorrow at 9 a.m. precisely. Who murdered the babies in the Toronto hospital on check at midnight? Will we ever find the killer at the Toronto sick kids? 9 a.m. precisely. Will they ever find the baby killer in Toronto? Check midnight. The legalization of heroin at 9 a.m. precisely.